that on September 11, 2001, there were attacks and there were planes that fell on the Pentagon, on the Twin Towers. There was, there was the World Trade Center attacks, and then, of course, the others that happened surrounding it. Now, the war on terror is becoming an adult. It's turning 21 tomorrow. And we are going to hear a lot about September 11th on, September 11th, 2001 on that day. It's going to be celebrated. It's going to be mourned. It's going to be talked about as this tragic day for the United States. And for the people that died, it was tragic. A lot of people died. A lot of working class people died, but a lot of people died just generally, especially in New York City. And my wife's uncle was lucky. He worked in that building, wasn't there when it happened, but a lot of people were affected. And people in the surrounding area, the illness, the sickness, it was awful. But what we won't hear from the Western media, from the U.S. corporate media, is the real tragedy that came out of. It's not just a tragedy that people died on that day in 2001 in the United States, but the real tragedy is how the U.S. responded to it. Because it's quite obvious that now in 2022, the U.S. has deep alliances with the very forces who were complicit in the attack. We know that Saudi was. We know that possibly Israel was. We know that there was a lot of complicity in this attack. I'm not going to make direct links. That's for others to determine. There's a lot of, circumstantial evidence and all kinds of things. And, definitely not trying to have YouTube take this video down just because I said the wrong thing about 9/11. But the real important thing about 9/11, 2001, is that the United States, despite their own fingerprints being all over this attack happening, right? Its own fingerprints all over it. And this was even covered by people like Michael Moore, right? Just the negligence, the absolute seemingly like, this is going to happen. Okay. It happened. And then the U.S. went on a rampage. It's quite obvious from the response that 9/11 September was very convenient for the establishment. In that, after 10 years of shock therapy, austerity, of unipolar domination, the U.S. saw an opportunity to escalate its agenda for global domination, to extend the dominance of capital at home and abroad, and to create a more repressive political atmosphere through this event. And that's what they did. So mass surveillance. I know people whose families were targeted, who they were targeted because they're Arab, because they practice Islam. They were targeted by U.S. intelligence. There was mass harassment followings all across this city, but all across the country. Then the Patriot Act, right? The Defense Authorization Acts, which now have military detention for suspicion of terrorism there. The whistleblowers that have been punished based on being called terrorists. The wars abroad that were waged. The wars abroad. Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan was invaded very soon after, blamed for the attacks, blamed for them, despite the fact that everyone in those planes were identified as Saudi, or as they were, there was no, right, Max Blumenthal has covered this in his book, no reflection on the fact that the U.S. had been pumping weapons and logistical support to forces like the Mujahideen since 1979 to undermine the Soviet Union and then to create favorable conditions across the Middle East by creating sectarian strife, by creating armed conflict, right? The U.S. had been supporting these groups. The U.S. created, right, out of these groups, then created fertile conditions for them by invading Afghanistan, and only Barbara Lee voted against it. Everyone voted for it. Everybody voted for the invasion of Afghanistan because it was the right war, right? It was the right war because Afghanistan was the blame. And only in 2021 was that quote unquote ended. And we see now the people of Afghanistan being starved literally starved by the United States, babies dying because the United States wants to continue to wage war as this war on terror. Now the Taliban, right, is the force that needs to be overthrown. And that was what we were told, that the Taliban was to blame. The Taliban had committed these attacks, right? Osama bin Laden was the one who committed these attacks. And despite the fact that he wasn't connected to Afghanistan other than maybe seeking refuge there once in a while. So these wars, right? And then Iraq, nothing to do with anything that had to do with September 11th, but Iraq was invaded in 2003. And then, of course, you have General Wesley Clark, the former NATO secretary, saying, well, after the war on terror, I heard Donald Rumsfeld. What did he tell me? He told me that we're going to invade 7 countries. That's what we're going to do. 7 countries in as many years. And that included Iran, that included Libya, that included Somalia. I believe Lebanon might have been on that list. Syria was definitely on this, and Iraq and Afghanistan. I believe those were the 7. And so the U.S. military apparatus expanded trillions of dollars, right? Millions of deaths, 1 million in Iraq alone, 50 to 100,000 Afghanistan, Pakistan, altogether, probably more than 100,000 people dead, killed. This isn't to mention the proxy wars, the instability in Somalia, now Yemen. We see what's happening with Saudi Arabia and Yemen, but the United States helped fuel that situation. So the war on terror has been a disaster for the region. It's been a disaster for the world. And it's been a disaster for working class people in the United States who have seen just incredible amounts of resources get funneled to surveillance, private contracting, the militarization of the police, of everything, so to speak. Everything was militarized. Everything you can think of has been militarized since 9/11. So you won't hear any of that tomorrow. Well, today's September 10th. You won't hear any of that on September 11th, 2022. You won't have any calls to end these destructive wars, including the proxy wars on Afghanistan still, Syria. You won't hear any of that. But the legacy of the war on terror remains. It remains in the project of endless war. The war on terror was really the declaration of endless war. It was endless war on all people who dare to resist empire. And this included anyone in the United States and the West that dared to even think that they would resist empire. Because some people say, oh, my privacy, I don't need it anyway. I know so many people who have said that to me. I have nothing to hide. Well, if the NSA is spying on you, if the NSA is taking your data, if all the intelligence agencies are conducting a war on terror on you because they believe anybody could be a suspected terrorist, then that means your political activity, should you decide, well, I don't like injustice, I don't like war, I don't want to see people die, I want to see people have what they need, their basic human rights met, then you could be a terrorist. You could be militarily detained indefinitely. You could end up like Julian Assange. This is the legacy of the war on terror. It's not about whether you have anything to hide or not. It's about this war on everybody, right? Creating a overall political atmosphere and a policy that says, well, we're already preparing the way. We're universalizing a policy that had existed exclusively for revolutionaries, exclusively for people who were fighting the system, who were saying we want a better system. Now that's been universalized, right? So what happened to the Black Panthers? What happened to the early labor movement? What happened to the American Indian movement? Those policies were expanded under the war on terror. So it was a war on everyone except for the elite. And then, of course, the wars abroad were against all countries who dare to resist. So Somalia, you remember Somalia, the Islamic Courts Union, and they were punished for it mightily. Syria, sovereign government. Iraq under Saddam, that was a sovereign government. That was on the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. It was a sovereign government. Had to go. Afghanistan wasn't necessarily a sovereign government, but still sitting on top of trillions in mineral resources, and at one time had been sovereign, at one time had a socialist government. Well, let's keep that let's keep that going. Let's make sure that doesn't that doesn't happen again. And of course, let's make sure that Afghanistan, it's really is a route between the East and the West. Let's make sure we have control of that. Iran, sovereign government, right? Like there's a pattern here, right? Libya was a sovereign government, was a government that stood up for liberation movements, the most prosperous country in Africa, right? It gave aid to South Africa, it gave aid to the Irish, it gave aid to African liberation movements. Libya was a government that had to go as well, and the War on Terror declared a war on Libya that would eventually transpire in 2011. So that's the legacy of the War on Terror. That's what it is. And it's American exceptionalism on steroids. It's all about creating this other, right? That these terrorists over there, that largely the legitimate ones, largely created by U.S. policy and Western policy, but that those terrorists justify anything and everything, right? It's not about, look what China did. It's not about, oh, maybe we should help Iraq and Syria, all these countries. Maybe we should help them elevate their levels of standards of living and their education, right? Maybe we should support what they already had so this wouldn't happen. Libya was literally like, hey, we'll work with you on eliminating terrorism as long as it's like actually terrorists. Gaddafi was working with the West saying, yeah, we'll get rid of these armed groups. They're a real thorn, right? They were real. Al-Qaeda was a real thing. But of course, the contradictory policy was that the U.S. was covertly backing it and had been since 1979. So it was always about destabilization, and the War on Terror continues to do that.